Hi, I'm Old Norse Specialist Dr. Jackson Crawford. My specialization is, as that kind of memorized pat intro has it, in the Old Norse language and in literature written in it, like the mythological poems of the Poetic Edda, our original sources for the stories of Loki, Thor, and Odin. But on my Patreon-supported channel, dedicated to bringing good information about Norse subjects and Norse-related subjects to the wider world, I sometimes dip a toe into history and archaeology, which, regrettably, are very different fields in terms of who studies them, what departments they might be in. And so some of this, early on in my channel's history, I was often a little bit reluctant to touch on because it takes so much for me to feel like I've learned enough to be of value in talking to you about it. But there's a very good recent book on a subject that I've often been requested to deal with in this channel, which is the Varangian Guard, the Norse mercenaries who guarded the Byzantine emperor in the Middle Ages. The new book by Sverrir Jakobsson is The Varangians in God's Holy Fire. It was published in 2020, and it is very academic in language, something that's quite different from my own translations and writings. It's fine, different people have different tastes. It's also very expensive, I'm sad to say, but because I have been forgotten by the University of Colorado, where I still have an unpaid position, I can still access the library, and I was able to read it that way. So I'm going to report to you on a little bit of what I have read about the Varangian Guard, principally in that book, and then, of course, supported by my own readings of Norse literature, and point you to that book for a rich amount of more information on the subject. So the word Varangian has already come up quite a bit in at least one other video on this channel. My interview, together with my Patreon supporters, of Dr. Vicky Grove, a specialist in Slavic languages and literature. We talked quite a bit about the Rus in the early history of Ukraine and Russia, as of course the Norse have a big role to play in the medieval origins of those states. Now, in Ukrainian or Russian, the term in question that's related to what we say in English Varangian, Ukrainian I believe is said Varyahi, and Russian I think the emphasis is different, it's Varyagi, but I could be wrong, I'm not a Slavic language guy. Effectively means Norse in these languages, but of course we use it in a much more specialized sense in English, really just for the Varangian Guard. It comes from a Norse word, Varingi, which means someone bound by an oath. In fact, that var part is very vestigiously present still in English in the word warlock. That is the English cognate, someone who is sort of locked by an oath, probably to some kind of demon who gives him his magical power. But of course the Varangians are not magical. I just mean that it's the same word, deep roots. Now, as to the interactions of the Rus, the Norse and Norse-descended people present in Eastern Europe, with the Byzantine Empire, we have an early record in summer of 860. Patriarch Photios of Constantinople writes of an attack that very summer on the capital that fell, quote, like a lightning bolt from the furthest north. Now, this is before the Norse are actually well established around Kiev, which was only in the early 900s. But, of course, once they're well established there, we get more and more contacts with the Byzantine Empire. Emperor Leo VI entered into a formal treaty with the Rus as of September the 2nd, year 911. Reading the beginning of it, which is preserved in the Rusian Primary Chronicle, also one of the major sources that was cited in the interview with Dr. Grove about the Rus, we see 16 clearly Norse names in a row, and you can easily find the English translation of the Slavic original, but I'm going to give this to you with the names in their Norse spellings and pronunciation just to show you how clearly Norse they are. We of the Rus nation, Karl, Ingjaldr, Farulfr, Vermundur, Rolleifr, Gunnar, Haraldr, Karvi, Friðleifr, Hróar, Angantyr, Þróandr, Leiðulfr, Fastar, and Steinvidr are sent by Helgi. All of those names, with maybe one exception, look exactly like names that you see in the Icelandic saga. So these are clearly Norse-speaking people, or one generation removed from clearly Norse-speaking people. But the treaty in question from 911 didn't result in permanent peace. A well-attested raid in parts of the Persian Empire, and then in Anatolia, this modern-day Turkey, where, of course, the center of power of the Byzantine Empire was, in 941, did damage to the Byzantines, as did a subsequent pair of sea battles, but the Rus were attacked with Greek fire and burned alive with it during that encounter. Then by 944, some other kind of treaty was in force. By 952, when De Administrando Imperio was finished, this is a work that is also an important source for some of the Rus activities in this part of the world, written in Greek. The Rus were well established in Kyiv and in Novgorod in northern Russia, and their ruler, Sviatoslav, notice he has a Slavic name, son of Igor Ingvar, a name Norse origin, is a figure mentioned with respect in Greek language sources. Sviatoslav's mother, Helga, or Olga, would even visit Constantinople and accept baptism there in the 940s or 950s. Curiously, Sviatoslav is ascribed by Byzantine historian Leo the Deacon, who probably met him personally. He describes him as having his beard shaven off, that is the part, the cheeks and jawline and chin, but his mustache left to grow long and bushy, and his head also clean shaven, except for a big part on the back left to hang over the side. And Leo the Deacon seems to suggest this is some kind of look of nobility among the Rus. Now, Sviatoslav's son, Vladimir, or Volodymyr, is a Slavic name, but we also see it in Old Norse as Valdemar, is the first Rus ruler to really burst into the historical scene in both Scandinavia and Byzantium. He is not that well attested in the Norse tradition, but is well attested in Byzantine, and even German and Greek and Arabic language chronicles, I believe. But one of the most famous Scandinavian-born warriors to serve the Byzantine Empire as a Varangian guardsman, who's also abundantly tested in Old Norse literature, is Harald Hardrada, or Harald Hardrada. I'm going to return to him in just a moment. Let me give you just a quick word from my friends and partners at Grimfrost. So in the mid-1030s, we encounter one of the most famous Scandinavian-born warriors who served the Byzantine Empire as a Varangian guardsman. That is Harald Hardrada, Harald Hardruler, later King of Norway. His career in Byzantium is abundantly attested both in Greek language Byzantine sources, where his name is Hellenized to Adaltes, and in Norse and Latin language sources written in Scandinavia, like Snorri's saga of Haraldr Sigurðarson, which is in Heimskringla. His patronym is Sigurd the Son, but he's better known as Harald Hardrada. Again, that's in Heimskringla, which major source for Norse history, written by Snorri Sturluson, the same guy who wrote the Prose Edda, as well as in Saxo Grammaticus's book History of the Danes, which is in Latin. Harald Hardrada remained in Byzantine service for more than 10 years, participating in dozens of battles as a leader of Varangian forces employed by Byzantium all over the empire from Armenia to Sicily. We have an interesting skaldic poem by Skald Bolverker Arnarsson about him in Byzantium. Hart knidi svol svartan snekju brand för landi skur en skrälla boru skeider brynjadar reidi. Mäter Hilmer så Malma miklagars för bardi morgskridu beta borgar barpfogar hoem army. A cooling rain wind pushed the black warship along the coast. The armored ships were resplendent with their equipment, The famous king saw the metal roofs of Constantinople beyond the bow. Many beautiful ships sailed toward the high city's wall. And of course, I translate only the word that's actually there, Sparter, as black. I don't translate blår as black, just in case you're wondering if it was actually blue. But then I think I'm the only person on the planet who argues that blår actually meant blue and not black in Old Norse. Anyway, beside the point. Eventually, by 1046, Harald Hardrada returned home to Norway and claimed the contested throne there, and for 20 years he ruled while imitating Byzantine practices both in church and military organization and in coinage. Now, by around his time, the time that he's serving, Byzantine historians such as John Scalitzes begin to talk about the Varangians as distinct bodies of troops, actually employed as particular units just of Varangians. So Scalitzes talks about, for example, an interesting Varangian regiment assigned to an area around Ephesus, where one of the Varangian guardsmen tried to rape a local woman, but was killed by her with his own sword. Now, interestingly, the other Varangians celebrated her courage and gave her all of her attempted rapist possessions, considering him a suicide. This reminds me a little bit of a scene in Laxdœla saga, where a woman is celebrated for the revenge she takes against a husband who had jilted her. Also reminds me a little bit of the kind of frank admiration of what very analogous to Norse drengskap or manliness that you see among the Lakota and some other Plains Indians tribes, where an enemy who acts honorably is going to be treated more decorously than someone from within the group who breaks the normal bounds or the hoped for bounds of manliness and good conduct. Now we have an early reference by Michael Ateliates in around 1080 to Varangians guarding the emperor's palace, and there is a legend that I am not entirely sure of the source of, that the Byzantine emperor, when he died, allowed for a 24-hour period during which his Varangian guardsmen could loot his palace. I'm not sure about the source of that. I may be able to track it down before I finish putting this video up, but I feel like I have to mention it because it's a cool idea no matter what. Now, after the Norman conquest of England in 1066, by the way, the very same series of incidents in which Harald Hardrada would die in England, we read in English and Byzantine works of large numbers of English noblemen leaving home to serve as Varangian guardsmen. And it seems to be right around then that the Varangian Guard's heyday of being really a Scandinavian institution starts to dwindle, and we get a lot more Englishmen in the subsequent centuries. Now, there's also some really cool runic inscriptions that attest to Varangian activity. One of the most notable, I think, is from Ed, Sweden. This is cataloged as U112. Ragnvaldr let rista runar efter Fostvi, móður sína, ónæmsdóttir dó í eyði. Guð hjálpi ónd hennar. Runarrista let Ragnvaldr, var og Gríklandi, vas liðs foringi. Now this is from the late 1000s, so toward probably the end of the exclusively Scandinavian period of the Varangian Guard. Here we read, Ragnvald let the runes be carved in memory of Fostvi, his mother, daughter of Onam, who died in Eid, the Old Norse form of the name Ed, the place name still today. May God help her soul. Ragnvald let the runes be carved. He was in Greekland, right, Norse term for the Byzantine emperor, and was the leader of a troop. So we have, there's many more than that, but a good number of runic inscriptions attesting to this activity. We also find Varangian guardsmen mentioned quite often in the sagas. Icelandic members of the Varangian Guard come up pretty often there. Of course, most of the sagas are from Iceland, so that's why Icelanders coming up is more natural than Swedes, Norwegians, or Danes in these sources. These include some contemporary sagas, in e.g. Sturlunga saga, like Guðmundar saga Dura, which concerns events in the 1190s and is written right around then. There we meet, for example, Sigurd the Grikkr, like Sigurd the Greek, because of his Greek ways and his time spent in Greekland, who's returned from Constantinople with a Byzantine sword. The sword, called Brynjubiter, armor biter, changes hands several times over the next few decades and is a prized possession by men in the next few sagas in the sequence. This is part of the Sturlunga saga sequence of sagas. In Laxdale saga, we read about Bolli Bollason, who goes to Miklagar, their big enclosure, big town, which is what the Norse called Constantinople. They serve in the Varangian Guard, and he brings back immense wealth and comes back fantastically sharp-dressed, as you would expect of a wealthy Norseman. And one of the most notable of the Varangian Guardsmen in the Norse sagas is the brother of the hero Grettir in Grettir's saga, Thorstein Osmundarson. After his brother Grettir is killed by Thorbjorn Ungel, Thorstein goes to Constantinople and joins the Varangian Guard. Now, the killer of his brother, this Thorbjorn character, also goes and joins the Varangian Guard. Now, there's a scene in the saga at a Vopnathing, a assembly of armed men who bang their weapons on their shields to show consent to various measures that are proposed to the group, where the Varangians are showing off their weapons, and the murderer Thorbjorn pulls out the sword that he killed Grettir with and passes it around for other men to admire. When it comes to Thorstein, Grettir's brother, Thorstein grabs it, kills Thorbjorn the murderer with it. Thorstein is thrown into a dungeon for this, but he's bailed out by a noble lady who later becomes his wife and returns to Scandinavia with him, which is probably fantasy, but it speaks to the way that the Norse, still in saga writing times in the 1200s, looked upon the Byzantine Empire and Constantinople as a source of prestige, and definitely a place that you might go and meet a nice-looking, rich lady that you could bring back to Scandinavia who would somehow be content living in the backwoods of Iceland with you, or back heaths of Iceland with you. All right, well, from the beautiful backwoods of Wyoming, a very special spot, thank you to my Patreon supporters for allowing me to continue to make a living from teaching 2 years and some months after the end, after I decided to quit teaching in the university system. And from the bottom of my heart, from beautiful Wyoming, to everyone out there, all the best to you.